because you can only, they were true or correct. You can only definitively diagnose CTE by brain autopsy. And they have found that some people have only expressed with neurological symptoms. I mean, I'm not saying I could practice law. I don't have the same executive function I once had. But I'm still pretty cognitively sound. And so apparently these people ultimately found to have CTE. Then finally, another expert who we consulted said, and I quote, "Your autonomic nervous system dysfunction is not like anything I've seen before. Can you possibly get in to see the doctors in Boston?"
So now I'm going to take over for a few minutes. So we, at the time, for about 10 years, had been on the board of advisors for the Concussion Legacy Foundation, which began at Boston University and was co-founded by Drs. Chris Nowinski, who you may see on television talking about football concussions and head hits all the time, like Tua's problem this week, and the 3 young kids who died of encephalopathy in the last 3 weeks, and also Dr. Robert Cantu. And so this doctor said, "Can you possibly get in to see the guys in Boston?" I said, "Well, I sure hope so. We're on their board of advisors." This was on a Thursday, and on Monday we were sitting in Dr. Cantu's office. And Dr. Cantu is just an amazing person, and he was really the first doctor we saw who understood and had been supervising research on CTE. I know we have medical students here in the audience, and I want to tell you how important it is for you to know about this, because this disease is far more widespread than people have realized, and it's really important because a lot of the people who are being found to have it now are young people who, for example, take their own lives and are as young as 17 years old, but they've played football since they were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. And you see tackle football, these little kids in helmets that their necks aren't even strong enough to hold up. In any case, we were up there and we were introduced to the physical therapist. I know we have physical therapists here and rehab people who effectively saved Hank's life. Her name is Dr. Naseem Shadawala. Hank said he couldn't walk. He was in a wheelchair at that time and extremely despondent. This is at the Cantu Concussion Center, and she has him in a harness. You can't see the whole thing, but she and her colleague are training him to walk again. And she also did work getting him to use hiking poles. That's Dr. Chadawala. And you can see his mouth is going. She kept him in the motor mouth position, counting backwards from 3, from 100,
97, 94, 95.
On their little track as a way to distract him from the real disequilibrium he faced. He couldn't walk down the hall to the cafeteria without collapsing. It was just amazing, the work she did with him. She still sees him. We drove to Boston every single week for her to work with him because it really made a difference. And then here he is, the first time he walked around the track without the hiking poles, really concentrating very hard. But now she has him doing all sorts of exercises, and last week we did a 3.6-mile hike at Planting Field. We still see her every week now by Zoom, but she's really saved his life. In addition, Dr. Cantu's team ran a battery of tests, which have since been repeated twice at Northwell. And while they found his executive function has decreased, despite the pathetic brain scans, his cognition is still generally good or superior. So they have insisted that Hank have a neuropsychologist, and they threatened Northwell if they didn't find a neuropsychologist that they were going to make us drive back up to Boston every single week. But Northwell miraculously found one. So that's another lesson for your medical students, that sometimes you have to be the ones to put the pressure on the other system, because Northwell was telling us so they didn't have anybody, but as soon as the Cantu concussion people at Emerson Hospital called and insisted, miraculously, this wonderful person was found, and she's been terrific. So can you just tell people a little bit about the newest findings on CTE from the last 3 or 4 months?
Yeah. Well, it used to be that CTE, that it was thought that CTE is caused by concussions. We now know that that is not correct. The newest research has documented the causes of CTE as the number and the strength of head hits, which really, to my mind, translates into the number of hits that cause the brain to move inside the skull. They can be concussive. If we're defining a concussion as something that's been diagnosed, they might be subconcussive, or they could be even worse than a hit that causes a diagnosis as a concussion. But it's the number and strength of head hits over time. So the longer you play, the greater the risk. And these repetitive hits cause abnormal tau protein to accumulate in particular patterns and regions of the brain. And as I was saying to someone earlier, most of these hits don't occur during the game. Most of these hits occur during practice. Not to worry. That happens to me usually in church.
Thank you. Bill?
And unfortunately, the NFL has now prohibited hitting. The Players Association has negotiated that you can't have hitting in practice more than 14 days a season, but the NCAA and the high school leagues and the Pee Wee leagues have not adopted that. So the NFL, you can only get 14 days of hitting a year, and outside of games, and in the Pee Wee leagues, they're hitting every single game.
Well,
Wow.
the most vulnerable people are
Right.
just at the mercy of what the head coach wants to do.
Right.
I mean, we were driving the other day in Glen Cove, and they had a bunch of kids, they couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. They were, colliding into each other.
Wow.
I mean, if your kid is going to play, you really got to be sure the people involved understand the dangers.
And Concussion Legacy Foundation recommends flag football only before the age of 14, when your body is better developed to even hold a helmet on your head. So I just want to mention that this 2017 newspaper article from the New York Times was the one that really catapulted CTE into attention of the public. And this is about the first 110 autopsies on NFL brains that were done by the Unite Boston Brain Bank at Boston University, and Dr. Ann McKee, who is a wonderful person, but very frustrated. 109 of the 110 brains had CTE. And that was all of the NFL brains that they then had. As of February 23, they have 376 NFL brains that they had identified, and 345 of the 376 had CTE, so that's a 91.7% of CTE for these contributed brains. Before moving on, I should say that Hank is now participating in 2 clinical studies that the brain bank is running, because as he mentioned, you can only diagnose CTE upon autopsy. So the new holy grail is to try and find those misfolded tau proteins in living people by testing their blood. And so Hank's just finished the battery of the tests, and they've taken this blood, and he's pledged his brain and spinal cord to the brain bank after his death, which I hope is a long time away.
Not for yours.
Well, so you were very incapacitated in 2016, 2017, and 2018. So how did you cope on a daily basis, and what kind of things did you turn to cope?
Well, I distinctly remember that morning I woke up in 2017, and I had this, I was approaching 70, and that was an ominous number for me. And I thought, Hank, you're getting older, you're ill, how much longer do you have? And I felt this compulsion to start writing. I had this visceral feeling that I was dying, and I wanted to leave something of myself behind. I wanted to document what my life had meant to me before it was too late. And I wanted to confront my fears, and at that time, the anger and the grief that was boiling inside me. And at first, I got my journal, and I started writing about my symptoms and how I was feeling. And then that kind of morphed into essays where I wrote about my family, and I wanted to come to terms with how I felt about football, my life as an athlete. And that gradually morphed into poetry, which I hadn't written. I maybe wrote a couple of poems in English class when I was in high school, but hadn't written anything since. I was particularly inspired by the lyrics of Leonard Cohen. I started listening a lot to Leonard Cohen, considered him a poet first. That was a big influence on me. And I found that writing in general and writing poetry in particular took what was happening in here and put it on the page. It was very cathartic for me, very freeing to get these things down. And writing also helped me realize, what do you think, Hank? What is it you really think? Writing helped me understand what I really think. Poetry also helped me find a new normal and to make an effort to notice things we often take for granted. I call it the beauty of the ordinary, which poetry does for me. And especially important for me because I've always tended to be a person that maybe lingers a little bit too long in the past and worries a little bit too much about the future. And poetry helps keep me balanced and more present. Poetry also has opened a world of music to me. I can't read music. The only singing, and I did a lot of singing, but the only singing I ever did was in the shower. Sometimes I thought, I don't sound too bad. But eventually, some of the poetry that I did, and I started putting a tune to it or a melody to it. And then I started singing it to myself.
Why don't you tell the story for Song to a Higher Power?
Well, this is a song that we will play for you
In a minute,
in a
tell
moment.
the story.
But I got the idea for the first stanza of this poem. It's actually fairly long, the rest of the poem built from that first stanza. But we were on one of our hikes up Mount Washington, and they had a video visitor center on the summit, and it was of rangers standing outside in the dead of winter, and very severe weather conditions. And he had a thermos of coffee. You could see the steam swirling up from the thermos. And he had a mug down here, and he poured it out, and it never reached the cup. It just turned to flakes and evaporated. And I thought, boy, if my troubles, if my anger, if my grief could evaporate like that coffee, wouldn't that be great? So that's where I got the idea for the first stanza that built into this poem that eventually became a song.
But you would walk around singing at the top of his lungs. And I'm sure the DiPietros have heard him doing this, and it was quite celebrated in town that he'd be walking the patios. Are we going to be able to play the song?
Yes, right now.
Okay. Yeah, we're ready. Summer and winter.
Make it